Welcome to the School of Love, the place where miracles are normal. Hello and welcome to the School of Love, the place where we learn practical tools based on scientific research and our own experiences towards improving ourselves, living life to its fullest, and contributing to the best of our abilities to the world around us. I'm Dr. Maria Grajdian and I'm a professor of media studies and anthropology at Hiroshima University. In my free time, I am doing my best to guide you in building up a life of contentment, joy, and fulfillment while applying lessons learned in school to overcome the difficulties, challenges, and insecurities of the real world. In today's video, I focus on the animation series Death Note from 2007, which generated a great shock when initially released, as it reflects the convulsions of the Japanese society after the big economical disenchantment in the early 90s, and simultaneously provoked a fresh current due to its aesthetic ideological statements. Assuming that identity in Japanese modernity is a liquid endeavor depending constantly on two parameters of the identity construction system, the social actor as player and observer of the construction practice and the historical context of this very practice, analyze the process of identity construction in Death Note through the pragmatic employment and creative development of heavy metal elements in its soundtrack, with focus on its opening title song. The tension between brutal heavy metal sound framework and meditative haiku-like lyrics on the one hand, and between the Western appealing of musical background and the Japanese language on the other hand, reveals in the course of the analysis the permanent tension in the Japanese modernity between a strong masculine other, that is the West, and a weak feminine self, or at least as strong respectively weak perceived. This tension could only be relieved through the emergence of a new self-consciousness to unify harmoniously outer challenges and inner structure. Thus, the combination of Western sounds and Japanese language appears not only as a late reformulation of the 1880 slogan Wakon Yosai, which usually translates as Japanese spirit or Japanese roots and Western knowledge and technology, but the active attempt to cope with past fears and integrate the Japanese culture into a wider world culture. This active, though subliminal, questioning of the prevalent power relationships through the liquefaction of gender paradigms and identity formulas seems one of the basic elements in the success of the animation series Death Note. Since its outburst in the West during the late 1980s, the Japanese animation developed itself during the last more than 3 decades into the most celebrated artistic medium to transmit Japanese culture and mentality next to manga or Japanese comics. Beside the visual dimension epitomically represented by typical design and characters construction, the auditive dimension contributes to creating a fascinating, contradictory, interactive universe. The theoretical background of my analysis is the concept of identity as liquid entity emerging from the convulsions of discursive formulations. I refer to identity as the result of discursive power as formulated by Michel Foucault, which I enrich with the notion of speech game as introduced by Ludwig Wittgenstein and developed by Jean-François Lyotard. Methodologically, I regard Japanese animation not solely as a popular phenomenon, but rather as a dialectically, socially and culturally determined ambivalent orchestration of the Japanese modern world. Correspondingly, I analyze hermeneutically the way in which heavy metal and identificatory mechanisms interact in soundtracks of Japanese animation in order to reveal the challenges, limits, and contradictions of identity construction in Japanese late modern popular culture. And now, first things first, that is, 2 disclaimers. The first disclaimer serves to strongly emphasize the fact that this YouTube channel, The School of Love, is not part of my educational and research activities at Hiroshima University. It is nonetheless part of my privilege, joy, and sense of duty to propagate and implement knowledge, information, as well as motivation and inspiration outside the limited framework of academic endeavors. Together, we can build up a better tomorrow for as many of us as possible. The second disclaimer relates to the fact that I'm a trained musician and musicologist, not a psychologist, therapist, or counselor. The ideas I am sharing in my videos reflect my deep-going preoccupation with life, my own life and other people's lives, and express the results of my experiences, research, and, for better or for worse, my failures as well as my recovery from those failures, recovery which is continuously ongoing. The ideas expressed in the videos on this channel, named The School of Love, cannot and may not and must not replace the consultation with specialists in whichever areas of your life you might have questions or you might struggle with. If you are new to the channel at this moment, I would like to ask you to please consider subscribing, sharing, liking, commenting. Thank you very, very much. This helps us not only with that mysterious algorithm which seems to dominate the YouTube galaxy, but also with contributing to the expansion of the community of humans doing their best to impact positively the world and those around them by discovering their authentic selves and living life wholeheartedly. Thanks again. Since its outburst in the West during the late 1980s due to the blockbuster Akira from 1988 directed by Otomo Katsuhiro, Japanese animation cartoons have developed during the last more than 3 decades into the most celebrated artistic medium to transmit Japanese culture and mindset, next to manga or Japanese cartoons. As part of the incommensurably complex structure of Japanese culture, animation has deep roots in traditional Japanese discursive and imaginary art, going back as far as the 10th century. However, now it is a highly commercialized product with its own market, audience, industry, ideology, and aesthetic. Superficially conventionally and stylistically eclectic, ideologically confusing and aesthetically challenging, naive and cool, animation emerged as a new form of soft power, threatening to unsettle and eventually disrupt traditionally confirmed concepts of identity, self, and culture. Beside the visual dimension, epitomically represented by typical characters, mostly androgynous with endlessly long legs, incredibly big eyes, as well as hair dyed in all colors imaginable, the auditive dimension contributes to creating a fascinating, contradictory, interactive universe. Thus, there is the omnipresent narrator or voiceover, the proper dialogues and monologues with voices borrowed from the so-called seiyuu, as well as the sound effects and the accompanying music. Seiyuu refers to voice actors and actresses in Japan, a far broader notion and market than in the West. This goes as far as that some Japanese voice actresses, rather than voice actors, have devoted international fan communities, for instance Hayashibara Megumi, Koda Mariko, and Yamamoto Maria. Besides around 130 voice acting schools in Japan, there are special magazines focusing especially on voice acting, such as Voice Animage being the longest running. Generally referred to as OST or original soundtrack and BGM or background music, and exactly as in live action movies, musical soundtracks contribute in animation works to creating a specific atmosphere and to underlining certain situations and transitions. They represent, in addition, important economic aspects, being professionally merchandised worldwide as the market demand and correspondingly the offer is highly competitive. It is not the classical marketing of the musical background in the Wagnerian tradition as sound companion of the events on a visual level, but rather the marketing of musical products as independent commodities within the entertainment and consumption industry. This video focuses on one animation series which seems to reflect to its utmost the convulsions of the Japanese society after the big economical disenchantment in the early 1990s. The 37-episode television animation series Death Note, directed by Araki Tetsuro. The animation series, with a target audience of shonen, that is, male teenagers, corresponding to its artistic counterpart manga, stands out due to its soundtrack, combining different styles and genre from heavy metal to ethnopop, from Western classics to Eastern modernisms, and back to rap. In addition, Death Note was released at a moment when the Japanese entertainment market, mainly influenced either by Studio Ghibli works or by Walt Disney Productions, underwent an ideological as well as aesthetic crisis. Due to its anti-establishment statements, where the main character is a classical anti-hero, to the soundtrack appealing to subliminal fears in the audience's consciousness, and to the message passing the traditional media-related framework without coping with Ghibli or Disney cliches, the animation series gained a huge success, evident from box office figures. This subsequently influenced the animation and film industry in Japan and worldwide. Based on the assumption detailed later on that identity in Japanese modern culture industry is a liquid endeavor, depending on at least two parameters of the identity creation system, the social actor as player and observer of the identity exhibiting practice and the historical context of this very practice, I firstly analyze how identity is constructed and dealt with in Death Note. I proceed through the concrete employment and creative development of heavy metal elements in Death Note soundtrack, focusing on its opening title song. The tension between a brutal heavy metal sound framework and meditative romantic lyrics on the one hand, and the Western appeal of the musical background and the Japanese language on the other hand, reflects the continuous tension in the Japanese modernity between a strong masculine other, that is the West, and a perceived weak feminine self. This tension can only be released through the emergence of a new self-consciousness to harmoniously unify an outer and inner order. Consequently, the combination of Western sounds and Japanese language appears not only as a late reformulation of the 1880 slogan Wakon Yosai, which translates usually as Japanese spirit or Japanese roots and Western technology and knowledge, but expresses the active attempt to cope with past fears and integrate the Japanese culture in a wider global culture. This active, though subliminal questioning of the prevalent power relationships through the liquefaction of gender paradigms and identity formulas is, as I argue towards the end of the analysis, one of the essential elements in the success of Death Note. Beyond the goal of tackling the issue of how identity is constructed in animation works through the presence of heavy metal elements in their soundtracks, this video searches for the restrictions and challenges included in cultural mass productions as reflections of their eras. Against the background of social, economic, and political events, culture media carry the messages of their creators to mass audiences. Animation soundtracks appear to be notable parameters contributing, in addition to further dimensions such as plot, character design, animation style, marketing strategies, and so on, to defining the success of animation productions. Methodologically, I do not regard animation solely as a popular phenomenon, but also as a socially and culturally determined dialectical appearance and as an ambivalent orchestration of the Japanese modern world. In presenting the multiple connections and interactions between heavy metal and identity in animation soundtracks, I proceed in 3 steps. Firstly, I explain the concept of identity as a fluid phenomenon. Secondly, I present my ethnographic object of animation as a social culture phenomenon in relation to the specific animation series and its soundtracks I focus on. Death Note. Thirdly, I analyze the way in which these two elements, heavy metal and identity, interact in the opening song of the animation series Death Note as a case study in order to reveal the challenges, limits, and contradictions of constructing identity as an existential attitude. I conceptualize identity as a liquid entity emerging from Judith Butler's idea of gender as a result of discursive power, which I enrich with the notion of the language game as introduced by Ludwig Wittgenstein and developed later on by Jean-François Lyotard. In such a reading, identity as well as abstract notions such as reality, truth, and knowledge emerges less as a nature fact, but rather as a language game imitating real games with their rules and conventions. Identity is a language construction that depends on a speaker, a listener, and the contents of their communicational interaction. Furthermore, in order to express the contemporary condition of identity, I employ Zygmunt Bauman's idea of the liquefaction of all possible phenomena in late modernity. Thus, if identity used to be regarded as a solid structure to be determined by linguistic formulations, here I refer to identity as liquid, borrowing the shape of the container it is introduced into and dependent on the fragility of the container as well as on the care of its holders. Identity loses its meaning as a permanent entity and metamorphoses into a volatile material. It is still constructed via language formulations, but it loses its finality as language itself loses its central place in defining and determining the world. The liquefaction of identity from a broader perspective is, in spite of late modern arguments, not a typical contemporary phenomenon. This video deals with the novel problem of how the process of identity liquefaction is comprised within the general framework of history liquefaction and what is the Japanese solution to this disturbing issue, as evident in one of the most representative animation series of the 2000s, Death Note. The plot of the 37-episode animation series Death Note centers on Light Yagami, a brilliant university student who discovers a supernatural notebook called Death Note, dropped on Earth by a death god named Ryuk. This notebook grants its user the ability to kill anyone whose face he or she has seen by writing down the victim's name. Light Kagami resents the relentless increase of crime and corruption in the world around him, and although initially skeptical of the notebook's authenticity, soon realizes that the Death Notebook is real after experimenting with it on criminals. Due to the proven success of his first attempt, Light plans to become a god and to establish a new world order by passing his keen judgment on those he deems evil and anyone who gets in his way. Light attempts to create and rule a world cleansed of evil using the notebook. The efforts of a detective known as L and subsequently his successor Nier and Mello to stop him are doomed to failure. Light Kagami's version of Nietzsche's Übermensch is not, as the usual television animation series audience would expect, an outsider, but the essence of average social actors performing on the historical stage of their own existence. The languid approach to storytelling, unusual in commercial television animation series, the intrinsic fleshing out of the fantastic characters of Light and his nemesis L, and the multidimensionality of the action transforms Death Note into a paramount of late modern entertainment in Japan, spreading worldwide. In compiling the main character, the charismatic genial student coming from the upper middle class environment of a perfectly functioning family, the authors transformed him from a questionable character into a symbol of a late modern human. The constellation of characters and relationships networking around Light Kagami and his famous or infamous usage of the Death Note calls for an alternative way to coordinate society, as Manuel Castells once put it, so that social individuals become merely players in the hands of unscrupulous traders of power. While Light Kagami initially acts in the name of general common sense, excluding the criminals from existing society, it soon becomes clear that current rules and regulations according to which part of the world works are solely historically determined and fixed entities. As such, a single human who attains godlike powers can question and replace these according to another value system, one that is not necessarily better or worse, but simply different. However, Light's dubious actions as a social human and as a man gradually transform him into an inscrutable character, eluding average notions and judgment of good and evil, and thus increasing its confusing charm. Besides the visual dimension, the musical background of the television animation series Death Note is impressive as well, ranging from classical tunes to hard rock and Arabian modalisms, especially the first opening and ending themes sung by the Japanese visual kei band Nightmare are of importance. While Alumina, the ending title, maintains the standards and cliches of Japanese heavy metal in a soft way, The World, the opening title track, speaks openly of the clash between cultures and identities in the modern age. 広がる闇の中交わし合って革命のちぎり誰にも邪魔させるわけにはいかないから果実が告げた未来夢革命のちぎり誰にも邪魔させるわけにはいかないいつか僕が見せてあげる光り輝く世界をLight Kagami remains an individual character in the restructuring of value hierarchies and nostalgia categories within the Japanese entertainment industry. The subtly unpolished brutality of heavy metal sounds contrasts unexpectedly with the lyrics coming from the universe of haiku poetry, apparent in broken rhythmic patterns and abstract meanings. Furthermore, the combination of Western imagery and Japanese quotidian symbols carry reminiscences of a long-forgotten ideology of juxtaposing cultural identities and not of contrasting and eventually deleting them. This is carried, for example, by the Western symbol of the red apple, ideologically representing the Bible's forbidden fruit as the forbidden knowledge of life and death when Light acquires the death notebook and the power it confers to him. It can be juxtaposed with the Japanese quotidian symbol of the visual depiction of subway catacombs, where Light and L stay face to face and confront each other under the premises of being mutual enemies, on the background of a violent sound cluster combining heavy metal sounds and a surprisingly melodic line. Like the bad boys of heavy metal and of Nightmare, the audience is indirectly told, playing revolution in a world busy with the bureaucratic expansion of the modernity project across convulsive spaces and times, Light Kagami challenges in his geniality the pre-existing order without having the possibility to propose any other in-depth going project of human existence. His attempt to impose his own judgment over good and evil has historically seen its counterparts, but does not lead to a lasting effective result as it lacks vision. As a late modern anti-hero, charismatic but lacking fundamental ideology to sustain his aesthetics of life, Light Kagami transgresses the classical borders between existence and nothingness through the challenge of love as a means to transcend the human being. Ruthlessly exploiting the feelings and expectations of those around him, he goes on endlessly in his quest for justice and self-fulfillment. The emptiness behind his declared and openly displayed wish for general prosperity and happiness becomes obvious when confronted with alternative life systems that are not necessarily better or worse, but simply different. He longs at a certain moment for belonging and understanding, but his grandomanic ideals hinder him from seeing the sincerity and grief of those he was supposed to and would have liked to protect. By superimposing the signal-like sounds of Nightmare with the abstract haiku-like lyrics and with the confusing yet condescending animated images, the producers consciously question the Japanese project of modernity based not on its own artifacts and ambitions, but on imported dreams and frustrations. Unlike other outsiders of the animation world, Light Kagami is an antagonist playing the main role where the protagonist had long been assassinated. Nightmare sings in Japanese about the aborted project of love in a world where Light Kagami is not an exception anymore, but a general appearance subject to rules and regulations which transform him into a despairing automaton. Unable to go back the pathway of ideals and hopes he had himself shortly ventured in, Light Kagami sings incessantly in the ocean of hatred and fear he himself had created. His death is the negotiation of the modern Übermensch as constructed by consumerism, excess and surplus, a solitary individual in the midst of nowhere. Situated between what was called in the past East and West, Japan is obviously trying to reinvent itself again as a superpower. It does not collapse beneath its widely reported political and economic misfortunes, and surprisingly, its global cultural influences have grown quietly. From popular culture to consumer electronics, from architecture to fashion, from shopping habits to cooking style, and from corporate philosophy to a holiday mentality, Japan looks more like a cultural superpower today than it did in the 1980s when it was an economic one. The question of whether Japan can build on its mastery of the medium to project an equally powerful nation message seems to be answered satisfactorily by the proliferation of the animation phenomenon. Animation reveals Japan, and especially post-Hirohito Japan, as a symptomatic example of the post-industrialized late capitalist nations. Solitude, inner emptiness, loss of orientation, pessimism, egoism, and consumerism. Androgyny, as illustrated by heavy metal elements in animation soundtracks, appears as an existential attitude, an answer to conflicting identities, and an alternative to what Japanese sociologist Miyadai Shinji called life going on in an endless everyday, in which no big historical events will happen, nothing will change, and we'll just have to face the same boring everyday life forever. The adventures and mishaps of the animation characters are those of a whole generation trying to ignore old values, but not being able to replace them with new, authentic ones. They are longing for love and belonging and struggling to discover their real selves beyond everyday compromises and confusions. The inclusion of heavy metal elements in the soundtracks of animation productions represents several issues and trends in Japanese contemporary culture. Their contradictions are the contradictions of an entire generation caught up in the historical maelstrom of ideological and aesthetic turmoils. Like Kagami's demise represents the victory of life against the drive of death. The genius dictator is contemplating the disappearance of gods and the emergence of charismatic humans to replace them. This demonstrates the emergent crisis of humanity in late modernity due to the lack of models and ideals. Heavy metal in animation soundtracks illustrates this crisis through the valid mixture of Western sounds and Japanese lyrics in uncanny moods. It comes to underline the process through which what used to be regarded as solid identity evolved to liquefied and eventually to liquid identity. So this would be from me for today. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you for joining me, and I'm looking forward to welcoming you very soon again. Love and peace to you all.